Welcome to iVoices.org. This is Dave Kopel, Research Director of the Independence Institute, and today's guest is Professor Michael Huemer of the University of Colorado. Professor Huemer is a professor of philosophy, and we're going to talk today about the philosophical basis of a right to own a firearm. Welcome, Professor Huemer.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
How long have you been at the University of Colorado?
I arrived there in 1998.
And you are a tenured professor there now, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I got tenure in 2005.
So you, even before 2005, you were you'd published a variety of articles with a general pro-freedom, libertarian sort of outlook. So how'd you get tenure?
Well, the philosophy department is very fair-minded in Colorado. Philosophy is it's a more fair-minded discipline than most of the humanities.
Oh, really? So there's not the kind of pressure that there's to have diversity of people at some departments at CU that I've heard about, where they want diversity in the sense of people of different sexes, sexual orientation, race, ethnic origin, and all that, provided they all think the same way.
Yeah. Well, philosophy also has this concern about racial and gender diversity, but probably not as strong as other disciplines. They care more about your arguments,
and they're apparently open to intellectual diversity.
Yeah. It's common that people will think that I'm wrong, but they still think that I'm worth listening to.
Well, that's a great thing to hear, and it's nice to know there are still some pockets of free thought within the arts and sciences at the University of Colorado. So tell us about the article you published on the philosophical right to own a firearm. And again, this is not going to be we're not going to talk about law and the Second Amendment. You're talking about something that would, by your argument, necessarily exist in any society.
Right, yeah. So this is the basic idea, right? If you have a right to something, then you also have the right to defend that thing. So if you have a right to life, then you have the right to take actions to defend your life if it's threatened. And it seems to me that implies that you have a right to possess effective means of defending it. Now, in our society, that basically means a gun.
Okay, and by the way, let's for people who want to read this themselves, where was this article published?
Yeah, so it's from Social Theory and Practice, which is an academic philosophy journal in 2003. I have posted it on my website. I don't remember the exact address, but if you just Google me and "is there a right to own a gun," it'll come up.
Okay, and let's for making it easier for people to use Google or other search engines. Your name is Michael Huemer, Huemer. So that's and then just add is there a right to own a gun, and one will find it. So let me challenge the first thing there. Who says there's a right to self-defense in the first place? Yeah, I mean, once there is a right to self-defense, one can derive the right to have a gun for that. But why would there be a right to self-defense at all?
Yeah, good. So you can motivate this by doing hypothetical examples. So here's a hypothetical example. There's a killer who's coming to kill a victim, and an accomplice comes and holds the victim down, which prevents him from escaping, and that leads to the killer succeeding in murdering his victim. Now, obviously, the killer did something very wrong. What about the accomplice? So almost everyone has the reaction that the accomplice did something that was extremely wrong and about as wrong as the murder itself, maybe slightly less bad. Well, but the accomplice didn't actually kill anyone, so what did he do that was wrong? And what he did was he prevented the victim from preventing the killing. Right. So it seems to me that suggests that preventing someone from preventing a crime is about as wrong as actually committing the crime.
Well, now let's say there's a crime that's going on inside a house. And let's say it's something that's also not a immediate violent crime that's in progress, but some other thing that we think is bad. Let's say counterfeiting, creating false currency. The state, I believe, the government would prevent me from breaking into that guy's house by kicking down the front door and coming in with a gun and either shooting the people or maybe just not not shooting them, but using the threat of a gun and smashing their phony printing presses, with a sledgehammer. But they're preventing me from stopping counterfeiting. Yeah. And would you say in that regard the government is therefore complicit in the counterfeiting as an accomplice?
Well, I think it depends upon exactly what you were going to do to stop the counterfeiting.
Let's say I'm going to use some violence because I'm not just calling the police and telling them to come over. I'm breaking down the front door. I'm coming in violently, and my intention is not to harm any individual, but maybe I'll have a gun or a knife which could be used to threaten those people so they stay away, while my friends and I use sledgehammers to smash their their printing presses for counterfeit money to bits.
I think the reason why you're prohibited from doing that is that the state is afraid that you'll be violating people's rights, and they're not convinced, so they don't know that a crime is actually occurring until they've gone through their process. So they're afraid that you'll be doing that to innocent people.
And even if they said, well, Kopel has good judgment, they have to make a general rule, and we're better off having a general rule against self-appointed anti-counterfeiters breaking into people's houses.
I think that's the thought. I think that's a thought. But the difference between that and the case where somebody's about to be killed is, in the counterfeiting case, there is a way for you to stop the counterfeiting that doesn't require you to do violence directly. But in the case where somebody is under threat of violent crime at the moment, they don't have this other option, right? Like, you could call the police and then they could come and stop the counterfeiters. But if a violent criminal is about to commit a crime against you, you can't call the police and then wait for them. I mean, you could call the police and wait, but then the crime will already have been committed by the time they get there.
That's right, because as lots of police officers and some of the police organizations that I've written amicus briefs on behalf of in the Supreme Court and elsewhere explain, is the police can't be everywhere all the time, and they even if they come as fast as they possibly can, that may not be fast enough to save the victim.
Right. Yeah. So, I think there's a point here that the right of self-defense doesn't entail the right to do just anything to defend yourself, but it entails the right to take actions that are effective and reasonable to defend yourself.
Well, but isn't reasonable a social judgment, and can't society decide that it's always unreasonable to use violence, for example, or always unreasonable to use lethal force in self-defense? And indeed, there are some of your philosophical and legal counterparts over in Western Europe would claim that self-defense is at most a privilege granted by the state and not a right.
It would just be false, wouldn't it, to say that it's always unreasonable to use violence in self-defense? So maybe there's some leeway for different societies to decide differently what counts as reasonable, but saying that violence is never reasonable, that's beyond rational judgment, right? There clearly are cases in which violence is a reasonable option. So, unless you're a pacifist, virtually everyone agrees with that. If you are a pacifist, then I think you would also have to say that it's wrong for the state to ever use violence. So then the state would not be permitted to use violence to prevent people from using violence. So the state couldn't prohibit gun owners either. Right? Actually, the state couldn't prohibit.
Or the state could prohibit or just couldn't enforce that sanction with violence.
Right, yeah. Right. And their inability to use violence to enforce it would just make the law impotent.
Okay. Well, okay. So your claim is that you necessarily have a right to defend what is yours, and to use some degree of force at least, but it's to do that. And at the same time, different societies can make reasonable judgments about the amount of force that could be used. Are we in agreement so far?
I think that's right.
So one society might say, well, it's okay if you throw a grenade at the mob that's attacking you, and another society might say, just no grenades used for personal defense ever.
So I think that case is debatable. I'm not sure. But there's a problem with certain methods of violence that have too much collateral damage potential, right? So if you're throwing grenades, then you could easily hit people who don't deserve to be hit.
And isn't that analogous to the image we always hear from the gun prohibition groups about the person who's trying to defend himself and is going to hit innocent bystanders with stray shots from a firearm?
Well, let's say it's not as easy to hit innocent bystanders with a gun as it is with a grenade.
Because a firearm is directed in a particular direction, obviously, whereas a grenade explodes all around. But given that there is a right of self-defense to start with, why must it be necessarily that people have the right to the most effective means of vindicating that? In fact, this is, just to veer into law a little bit, this is one of the things that Justice Stevens talked about in his dissenting opinion in McDonald versus Chicago, where he said that the 14th Amendment, which says that no state may deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, in Stevens' view, this gives judges a great deal of latitude to protect liberty against unreasonable violations of that liberty. And he said that even without a Second Amendment, there's a pretty good argument that there's just a general right of self-defense and also a right to the means of self-defense. But in his view, it's also reasonable for the state to prohibit certain means, or especially depending on local circumstances, a city like Chicago, and the fact that Chicago bans handguns, and maybe there is nothing as good for self-defense as a handgun. In Stevens' view, well, so what? Or too bad. You don't necessarily have the right to the most effective means. So what's your response philosophically to that?
So suppose that the state prohibits the most effective means of self-defense, but still allows other less effective means. So because the most effective means was taken away, there will be some people who are going to suffer from crimes who wouldn't have otherwise if they'd had the most effective means available. Right? So for those people, the state has become, in effect, an accomplice to the crimes that were committed against them. The state has prevented them from preventing the crimes against them. And so I would say that the state would then be responsible for the crimes that those people suffered. That's about as wrong as if the state actually committed those crimes against them. Right? Now, it's not my claim that it's always wrong to use violence against people, even innocent people. However, the conditions for justifying that sort of thing are pretty strict. So if the state were to have a program whereby it was going to kill, rape, and rob a certain number of people in order to protect other people, they would have to be protecting a whole lot of people. There would have to be something really important at stake for that to be justified.
I've got two questions here. When you say that there's almost necessarily a right to the most effective means, can't there be a trade-off in terms of social utility that the government can make? So, for example, let's say poison gas. One could buy it in readily available dispensers, and it turns out that, as the organizations I represent in amicus briefs explain, that learning how to use a firearm effectively in self-defense, there's a certain level you can get to with several days' worth of training. But if you're, say, a police officer who might be in a real shootout against a bunch of gang members, you'd want to have much more training. And the same is likewise true for non-government employees. So let's say that a handgun, a good quality handgun, has a certain amount of effectiveness against a potential criminal. But we know there are plenty of cases where, you have a guy who could be pretty big and, say, under the influence of drugs and just also maybe kind of psychotic. So he may be one of those people you hit him several times with a well-placed shot, and he still doesn't go down immediately and keeps on attacking you, whereas our hypothetical poison gas is 100% effective when deployed against attackers. But it being a gas, it can blow around. and so it has 10 times as great a possibility of injuring an innocent bystander as a firearm does. So are you saying that if I as a legislator vote to ban poison gas in self-defense, I'm complicit in the victimization of all those people who could have saved themselves with poison gas but weren't able to save themselves because they can only use a handgun?
Probably not. So it matters whether the person who's taking the actions of self-defense is also potentially violating somebody else's rights. So you might think that people who are nearby have a right not to be subjected to excessive risks. And so the person who's using the poison gas for self-defense, so it's fine for him to defend himself, but he might be violating other people's rights, in which case you, in preventing that, you wouldn't be violating his rights. He doesn't have the right to defend himself in ways that violate other people's rights. So you wouldn't be violating his rights in stopping him from doing that, right? However, if he's only using a gun, then he's not violating other people's rights. And so you would be violating his rights in preventing that.
There's no intention with either the poison gas self-defender or the handgun self-defender to violate anyone's rights, but just the way I laid out this hypothetical, there was a much greater empirical possibility that the poison gas injures the innocent bystander. But why isn't that an empirical judgment up to the legislature to say that the handgun has too great a risk of stray shots, or more generally that the ownership of handguns in society creates innocent bystander risks, not primarily by the stray shot from the at the moment of self-defense, but the fact is handguns can be stolen and then they're used by criminals to violate other people's rights.
It is an empirical question. So if the risks of private gun ownership were much greater than they are, then the state would be justified in prohibiting them. But in fact, the risks are not unreasonable. So, you can look at the statistics on the probability of gun accidents. You hear a lot about accidents with firearms, but actually they're very rare. And firearms are much safer than a lot of other things we allow. So you're much more likely to... Swimming pools are much more dangerous than firearms. So if we assume that we don't think swimming pools should be prohibited, then firearms shouldn't be either. So yes, there's a risk that criminals could steal your gun and then use it wrongfully. But that is kind of true of just about anything that you would have, that a criminal could steal it and then do something wrong with it. And I don't think that if that happened, that you would be responsible for that. Right? You wouldn't be responsible for that unless you were in some way reckless or had done things that make it particularly likely for that to happen.
Or had negligently stored it somehow.
Yeah.
Okay, now how about back to the theory that if you deprive someone of the most effective means of self-defense, you're complicit in that person's victimization. So now let's take a guy who has just served a 15-year prison sentence for manslaughter and armed robbery, and in which he used firearms in his violent crime against others. And now he's out of jail. He's out of prison. Clearly, it would be wrongful for someone to attack him and victimize him and make him the victim of a violent crime. Does that therefore mean that the state cannot prohibit him from owning a firearm?
Well, this is a good question, and I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I mean, so one thought is, well, he's already paid his debt to society, so he should now just be treated like a regular citizen, right? But another thought is, well, we could say that part of the punishment for having committed those previous crimes is to not be allowed to own a firearm in the future. And so it would seem like, well, maybe that's a reasonable punishment.
But you couldn't possibly, as punishment, say, let's say somebody comes up and attacks you while you're just walking down the street. You're not allowed to fight back with your hands and fists. There would never be a legitimate punishment in that. And in fact, that wouldn't even be true for someone in a prison. If they were wrongfully attacked in a prison, they would still have, by another prisoner, they'd have the right of self-defense to at least use their body to protect themselves. And that, in your view, that could never be taken away.
What's different between that and firearms? Well, it would be really hard to prohibit somebody from having fists, and the that would be an excessive and cruel and unusual punishment.
Well,
so to
right.
speak.
So we wouldn't ban him from having fists, just ban him from using them against someone else.
If the criminal happens to have a gun and then he's being wrongfully attacked, then yeah, it would be wrong to prohibit him from using the weapon that he has to defend himself, right? So if he's violated the law by having a gun, it shouldn't be an additional violation for him to use the gun to defend himself. Okay. But it might be reasonable to prevent him from having the gun or prohibit him from having it, just because this particular person has shown a predilection to violate other people's rights. So it's not unreasonable to think that if he's acquiring a gun, then he intends to do something wrong with it. Right? It's different from ordinary people because the overwhelming majority of ordinary people would not use a gun for criminal purposes. But it's reasonable for us to think that this person is going to use the gun for criminal purposes, and therefore for us to try to defend ourselves against him.
So what the general thrust of your article, I think, is very much in keeping with the sort of the intuitive common sense of the vast majority of Americans and well within the mainstream of American politics. Yet, your article, at least among philosophers, is a fairly radical thing from the point of view of the United Kingdom or Canada and other countries of Western Europe, where you have the government that says, yes, you can have guns for sports under a licensing system, but people can't have guns for self-defense. Now, maybe if you actually owned a sporting gun and someone breaks into your home and attacks you, and you're able to get the gun out of the safe in time and load it, there's an increasing tolerance from a low level of the recent past. But the law is getting relatively better about allowing people to use a sporting firearm for protection in an emergency. But the idea of acquiring a firearm for protection in the first place is out of line in most of Western Europe. And some of the countries that share our British English law heritage. What's the cause of this divergence? And is America wrong, or are they?
They're wrong. Well, so you can understand why the government would want to take this position, because their job is supposed to be to protect us from criminals. So by allowing people to own firearms for self-defense, they're in effect admitting their own ineffectiveness. They're admitting that they can't really do what the main thing that we've hired them to do, and they don't want to admit that.
And if I could just interject, that point was exactly made in the early 1950s in accompanying a British law that basically now says you can't carry an offensive weapon, by which an offensive weapon, what they legally mean is any object which you might use for self-defense if you were attacked in a public place. And the point was made exactly what you said, that to allow people to carry anything for self-defense would be to admit that the government can't keep the peace at all times, and that was too insulting to the government, I suppose, hurt their self-esteem.
Right. But in fact, it's true. They can't protect us at all times. But now there's the other question of why a lot of citizens favor firearm restrictions. So my guess is that they haven't really thought through the rights issues. And they're probably convinced by the anti-gun groups that guns are extremely dangerous and that they cause more deaths than they prevent. But people haven't thought through the fact that it's a rights issue. It's the right of the individual who would be a crime victim to try to defend himself, and that violating that requires producing benefits that are much greater than the costs.
Okay, well, let me ask the New York City question, where in New York City, the way the firearms laws operate is you can have a gun, including a handgun, in your home for protection, but for carrying something in public, you will only get a handgun carry permit if you're, say, a retired police officer, or maybe a bodyguard for a celebrity, or a celebrity yourself, or depending on the particular administration, maybe you're high ranking in the mafia, and so on the inside, or you're an especially dangerous professions, such as you're a diamond merchant transporting your goods, or you might be taking large cash deposits to a bank from your retail store, and so that you get a handgun carry permit for while you're doing that. But for ordinary citizens, they would say, no, you can't carry a handgun for protection, but you can have pepper spray. And we acknowledge that pepper spray is not as good as a handgun for protection. That's why the police carry handguns rather than pepper spray, or they actually carry both, so they can have the option. But on the other hand, the risks of a handgun can be large, since it's a lethal weapon, whereas pepper spray is not. Pepper spray is temporarily incapacitating and painful, but you can't kill somebody with it, I suppose, unless you held them down and sprayed them for a very long time and gave them a fatal dose. But that's not that's not a normal risk, whereas so why isn't it reasonable for New York City to do that? Or you're claiming again that New York City's the city council or the police department is therefore complicit in all the people who got killed because they only had pepper spray to defend themselves and couldn't use a handgun.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it comes down again to the effectiveness of different means of self-defense, and it just happens to be that guns are the most effective means, right? And this is partly because they're widely feared, and well, they're more dangerous, and the dangerousness of them is also why they're more effective for self-defense. Now, so when I was doing the research for this article, I looked up the statistics from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which indicate basically that if you use any means of self-defense other than a gun, you're actually increasing the probability that you'll be injured. And a gun is actually the only thing that lowers the probability of your being injured and greatly reduces the probability of the crime actually being completed.
Right, and you probably also read Professor Gary Kleck's analysis of those National Crime Victimization Survey data. And I should point out that the non-firearms means of self-defense are, by at least some of the studies, do increase the risk of victim injury. On the other hand, they also reduce the possibility or the odds of crime completion. But also the NCVS is there's always more data coming in, and it's constantly being reanalyzed. And so let's just imagine that more recent research with more years of NCVS data conclude that actually all, in terms of the completion of the crime, it's all about, there are several means that are about equal to a firearm. Does that change your result?
The way you phrase that, you just mentioned the completion of the crime, but what about the crime victim being injured? So somebody's trying to rob you, and maybe by using the pepper spray, you reduce the probability that they will actually get your money. But if you're increasing the probability that they're going to injure you, then that seems not acceptable.
But does this philosophical thing then, does it come down in part to an empirical question?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So if somebody can show that new improved pepper spray is equal in both preventing crime completion and in preventing the risks of victim injury, and we can also get it down to sub-questions like what kind of victim injury and things like that. But once you empirically show something is as good as the firearm, then by your philosophical point of view, then that's fine. You could ban the one or ban the other. I mean, you could actually ban if we imagine the pepper spray and a handgun are equal, then the government would only have to allow you to have one of those.
Well, so the government would have to have some reason why it wants to prohibit one of these. So, I mean, if they're equally good at self-defense, but one of them has some other dangers to other people that the other one doesn't have, yeah, then maybe the government would be justified in prohibiting the one that's more dangerous. Okay. But I mean, I think it's unlikely that this would be the case, because the requirements for something to be useful for self-defense are very similar to the requirements for it to be useful for offensive purposes. So, I mean, it's the fact that that guns are widely feared and that they're easily used to injure people. That's why they're good for criminals, and it's also exactly why they're good for criminal victims to defend themselves from criminals. If you have something that's less lethal, the criminal is less likely to be afraid of it, and therefore they're less likely to be deterred.
Right, and the handgun has the ability to project force at a distance and is really unique in the sense of it being something that a smaller person can use to defend herself at a distance from several larger people. I mean, theoretically, a cloud of pepper spray could do that, but not nearly as effectively. But a handgun is, or a firearm in general, but the handgun's much easier to carry and deploy. Firearms are special for that, and as you say, that can also make them usable in reverse by the bad guys. It's probably the firearm is the one thing that a handgun that allows a scrawny 14-year-old to rob a liquor store, even though the two guys working behind the counter at the store weigh over 200 pounds and are pretty tough. So another I think interesting point you raised in the article was about the recreational benefits of firearms. So in England, for example, right now, and under current law, you can own a shotgun for shooting sporting clays or skeet and trap or for bird hunting. And you can likewise own a rifle for target shooting or for hunting. It's under a pretty stringent licensing system, but those can be lawfully possessed. And yet, at least at an occasional rate, some of those firearms that are lawfully possessed can be stolen by criminals and misused, or again, this is very rare in England, but a licensed gun owner could misuse the gun and injure someone, either intentionally or by accident. So if it saves one life, why not ban guns entirely in England, where the self-defense issue isn't even on the table, at least as a matter of law, and so all you're doing is giving up recreation to save somebody's life, or maybe to save several people's lives.
First, I want to emphasize that, in my view, the issue isn't just a utilitarian one. It's not just how much benefits and how much costs are produced by a law. It's also a rights issue. There's a question of whose rights are being violated. And if you're making a restriction that violates somebody's rights, then the requirements for justifying that are much stricter. The benefits that you're producing have to be much greater than the harms to the person whose rights are being violated. Now, I think that there's a tendency for people to assume that if saving lives is at stake, that automatically outweighs lesser goods like recreational value. But I don't think that that's right. So if we were to make every restriction that saves at least some lives at the cost of lesser values like enjoyment or recreation, then I think we'd be living in a society that none of us would want to live in. So we'd start by lowering the speed limits to 30 miles an hour everywhere, or we might even have to ban automobiles altogether. We'd have to prohibit people from eating potato chips because that kills some people eventually.
Well, don't worry, we're getting there fast enough on that particular one. We'll wait to the and outlaw high school football. I mean, we know that certainly kills several people. Sometimes several people per year, but you definitely know that over the course of 10 years of high school football being played, you will have some fatalities and also some lifetime crippling injuries. So why not?
Yeah.
Well, why not? Why is what is this about high school football that you Americans are so obsessed with that you're willing to put up with this carnage of dead and crippled players?
Well, so, I don't know about high school football in particular. I don't really get why it's so entertaining, but some people think that it's really entertaining. Right? But just as a general matter, if we prohibited things that entail a risk to life, but produce some entertainment value, if we prohibited everything of that kind, assuming that no amount of entertainment value outweighed even one death, then we would have a very boring society, and we would have basically I think we'd have lives that would not be worth living, because virtually everything that we enjoy would have to be prohibited. We would have to stay indoors, stay holed up in our little houses as long as possible and only leave when absolutely necessary. Right. I mean, part of what makes life worth living, or maybe all of what makes life worth living, is enjoyment. And, some people get a whole lot of entertainment value out of firearms. People who like to go out shooting. And, it's just part of what makes their life enjoyable.
Right, and you'd also say that at some point there's an empirical trade-off one can make. If, say, back to the high school football thing, if 3,000 athletes per year were dying from high school football, then maybe you could consider banning it. So back to the English situation, it's an empirical question of exactly how many of these recreationally owned firearms actually are stolen each year and used by criminals, or how often do the licensed recreational owners commit violent crimes. I mean, you would say that there could be a point at which the social harm becomes so large that it outweighs the recreational benefit of the larger number of people who enjoy it responsibly.
So I'm not a rights absolutist, right? The absolutists are the people who think that it's never permissible to violate somebody's rights, no matter what the consequence is. I don't think that position is defendable. But I just think that to be justified in violating somebody's rights, you have to have benefits that are many times greater than the harms.
So let's open this up a little broader. Who are the philosophers that you look to and have shaped and influenced you? And is there any official category of philosophers that you'd put yourself in?
Well, there are a lot of categories of philosophers I belong to. I'm an analytic philosopher. I'm sometimes a political philosopher, sometimes an epistemologist. I think very highly of Robert Nozick and his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. This is a libertarian classic, so any listener who hasn't read it should go check out that book.
Nozick, and available at fine bookstores everywhere, and at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all the rest. Sure, and let's just give folks a preview for what you're working on right now. I believe you're writing a book?
I'm working on a book about political authority.
And do we have a title for the book yet?
Well, tentatively, I'm calling it Freedom and Authority.
And I don't want to give it all away, but it's basically what is the nature of governmental authority, and why do we recognize some things and not others as governmental as authorities that can tell us what to do, and to what extent does that make sense? Would that be fair?
Yeah, there's an interesting philosophical question, because there's a stark difference in our attitudes towards government as compared to our attitudes towards all non-governmental agents. So most people think that the government is entitled to do all kinds of things that it would be very wrong for any other agent to do. So if the government has some beneficial plan, they're considered to be allowed to take money from people by force. If anybody else were to do that, we would call it extortion, and that person would go to jail. So there's a question as to why we attribute this special moral status to the state.
Well, and let me just bring this back to guns before we wrap up. If I went into somebody's house and took their gun because I think they're a bad guy and might use the gun soon to harm someone, I would be accused of theft. But we do have procedures with due process for that to be done collectively for us as a society by the government. I mean, you wouldn't want to have a police officer just doing it, with no checks and balances, but assuming that somebody brought a case to a court and said, here's the specific evidence that this guy is really a danger to himself and others, and maybe there's even a pretty imminent risk, and you had due process and a fair hearing and proper evidence, then it would seem intuitively legitimate for the government to then go to that guy's house and take that guy's guns away.
Yeah. So this is somebody that they have specific evidence against, like he's got mental disorders or he has a criminal record or something. Yeah. Yeah. So,
but I can't go around and take all the guns from the people, even I know to be crazy. I mean, maybe if there was, if there was actually somebody I knew well, I might, but I couldn't go to somebody I didn't really have a relationship with to do that.
Yeah, so that's what's usually thought, right?
Yes.
My view is, well, if you didn't have any better option, then actually you would be justified in doing that.
Right. So if there's some crazy, the courts are just not functioning for some reason, and crazy old Joe is sitting on his front porch, cleaning his rifle all day and screaming that the Martians are about to come, and everybody is worried that he's really going to snap pretty soon. Yeah. Then it's okay if the government's not available to do this for the folks in the neighborhood to take his gun away, at least for a while, till he starts taking his medication again.
Yeah, so I don't actually think the state has any special moral status, right? This other citizens in the neighborhood could do the thing that the state is supposed to do if the state doesn't do it.
Okay, well, this has been I think a fascinating discussion, and hope the audience thinks so too. And again, I'd like to thank Professor Michael Huemer, Huemer, from the University of Colorado. So go online and read his article on the right to own a firearm, and start saving your money so you can buy his forthcoming book. Thanks for coming, Professor Huemer.